Good morning to you. If you've joined us, you're on the fifth connection, and this is the 30th of January 2025. Theo is not with us this morning, but we continue right along in our talking through the storyline of the book of Hebrews. I've entitled this morning's teaching block, Testimony of Rebellion. Testimony of Rebellion. It was prior to 1994 that charges of treason, they were often leveled or used to suppress opposition to the apartheid government. There's only been one treason conviction in post-apartheid South Africa, and this happened in 2012. Members of the Boeramag, the far right wing, were convicted of treason, and this was one of the lengthiest trials in the legal history of this country. But what is important to note here is that the charges were serious. They related to 8 bombs that were set off in Soweto in 2002. And coupled to that, there was also an assassination attempt on the life of Nelson Mandela. But he, funnily enough, traveled to a school in Tzaneen, and he traveled by helicopter rather than a car, so the operation was aborted. Those convicted of treason were sentenced to 25 to 30 years in prison. The testimony of treason. The witness in Psalm 95, verse 8 to 11, is what the Holy Spirit uses. In the mouth of the psalmist warns believers against treason, such as that which blocked past pilgrims from entering God's rest. The psalmist warns believers against committing treason, because that was the thing that blocked those in the Old Testament, the people of God, from entering God's rest. So the question behind this section or slice of the text has to do with what was the result, or what is the result of committing treason against God? That's a very, very weighty question, because the question is, can believers commit treason? Many would remonstrate and say, no, that's not possible. Others would say that is possible. Those who say it's not possible do so for many different reasons. Some would say because God chose us in eternity past. Our salvation is secure because endurance is the hallmark of that kind of election, which is really Gnostic election. And so if God chose us in eternity past, how can he lose us? Because he chose us from eternity to or for eternity. The witness of treason comes up in verse number 7a of the biblical text, because the writer is demonstrating across 303 verses of the 13 chapters of Hebrews, which is addressed incidentally to Christian Hebrews, converts from Judaism, who now stand in danger of falling away because of persecution. Things are getting real hot. And they stand in danger of falling back, falling away. committing treason. So the author introduces this text from Psalm 95 in verse 7a. Watch what the text says. He first acknowledges the greatness of Jehovah in that psalm, Psalm 95. Jehovah is the king above all gods, is the king of kings. And having exhorted the congregation to worship their maker, the psalmist warns against unbelief, as in the days of the wilderness wanderings, when they lost their rest, when rest was not given because of unbelief. And so in the first 7 verses of that psalm, he acknowledges the greatness of Yahweh. And then 7b to verse 11, the psalmist warns the congregation against such unbelief. Because this warning of treason is what would rob them of finally entering into the land. Well, when you look at the biblical text here in verse 7 of chapter 3, in chapter 1, the first 4 verses, the writer is demonstrating that stick-to-itiveness is based on who the subordinate or the superordinate son is. He's no subby, he's the superordinate son. Then from verse 5 of chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10, verse number 18, stick-to-itiveness is based upon the superordinate way. Jesus is the true and living way because of his worth and his work. And then in the last 3 chapters, Jesus is the one who provides the superordinate son, as the superordinate son. Stick-to-itiveness through a walk which is characterized in a particular way in those 3 chapters. So right here in verse 7, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. You see, hardness of heart is a very, very interesting phenomenon. It's the whole issue of unbelief. And an unbelieving heart is mentioned in verse 12. Can a believer resort to having an unbelieving heart? Well, some would say no, because they were not believers in the first place. But why are they called brothers? In verse 12. Take heed, brothers. And then when you go back into verse 1 of chapter 3, therefore, holy brothers, you have a sacred share in a heavenly destiny. So we cannot argue that they are not believers. Today, if you hear his voice, the text says. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul is the one who has developed an unbelieving heart. He does something that shows his defiance of heaven. He stands in defiance of God because he does something. He offers a sacrifice to God in the absence of Samuel and makes all kinds of excuses when Samuel gets back and says, what have you done? Why have you done it? Of course, it's at that point that he is rejected by God as the first king of Israel. Numbers chapter 13, incidentally, and chapter 14 are the 2 chapters that talk about the people of God in the Old Testament raising their fist against heaven. 12 spies are sent into the land. They come back. 10 said, no, we can't take the land. And 2 said, go, we can take the land. 10 said, we look like grasshoppers in their sight, because they were in the land. They found the giant clans, the Rephaim, and every other kind of Eim. And that's why in chapter 14, from verse 11 onwards, God says to them, your carcasses will fall in the wilderness, and a whole generation dies in the wilderness. Everyone over the age of 19 drops. And so we have an interesting phenomenon here, because salvation is based upon faith. That which cannot be gained through sinless perfection cannot be lost through sinful imperfection. There's only one thing that can take place in the life of a believer that will get him to defy heaven, and that is unbelief, which verse 12 is going to talk about. So in the Old Testament, treason was called the sin of the high hand. The words in the original text is Biyad Ramah. Biyad Ramah is the sin of the high hand. And it was plainly an act of rebellion against God and his word. Numbers 15, verse 30 and 31 says, the one who blasphemes the Lord, the one who blasphemed the Lord because he has regarded with contempt the word of the Lord, that's blasphemy. A rejection of God and his word. And in the New Testament, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, or as it is called, the unpardonable sin, is the sin of the high hand. It was high treason and revolt against God with a clenched fist, a picket against heaven, if you will. But this is not a sin that's put in the same class as murder in the Old Testament, or adultery or the like. Treason or blasphemy against God was much more serious. It was that which was an attack on God himself. And so the question is raised, can a believer degenerate and walk away from what he once professed, from what she once professed? That's the singular thing that will take us out. The singular thing that will take me out is treason against heaven. So the question this morning is very simple. Have you walked away? Have you wandered far away from God? The hymn writer says, I've wandered far away from God, but now I'm coming home. Some have wandered and some have not returned. In verse 7b to verse 11, the psalmist's warning is very, very severe. Do not harden your heart as in the rebellion in the day of testing, where your fathers put me to the test. Therefore, I was provoked against that generation. They tested me for 40 years, verse 9 says. This generation provoked God. They always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And the first generation did not see the land. They did not enter God's rest. What about you as a believer? When you stop believing, what happens? Now you need to wait there with bated breath for the next interesting episode as we continue in the biblical text.